The Cleveland Browns may be the most hopeless team in all of football. Despite having what I would consider to be a high-end coaching staff, the Browns sit at a 3-10 record after making the playoffs last season, in large part due to having one of the worst quarterback situations in football. There are key pieces in place on this roster, but the lack of young talent on rookie deals and a regressing offensive line leave this team in a really bad spot in one of the toughest divisions in football, while also being in a much tougher conference quarterback-wise. But it's not just this year the Browns have found themselves in a tough spot. Since 2000, the Browns have the worst win percentage in the NFL. They're also tied for the worst in the league with just one playoff win in that span. 25 years with very little success to speak of. Since returning to the league in 1999, the Browns have had 12 head coaches, the most in that span. They've also started 38 quarterbacks in that same span, by far the most of any NFL franchise. Only 3 seasons have the Browns started the same quarterback in every game in the season. They also have a winless record in that span, just to add insult to injury. In more recent history, the 2020 Browns finished with an 11-5 record, led by their young superstars like Nick Chubb and Myles Garrett. It was their first winning record in 13 seasons, leaving Browns fans hopeful for a turnaround. This led to the aggressive decision to make a move for what the Browns were hoping would be a superstar quarterback in Deshaun Watson, mortgaging the future while signing him to a fully guaranteed 5-year contract, now viewed as potentially the worst trade in NFL history. Since the trade, Deshaun Watson has played like one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the league. While the team did make the playoffs just last season in 2023, it was Joe Flacco who was quarterbacking the team for that playoff run, not Watson. After another disappointing start to the 2024 campaign with one of the worst offenses in the league, Watson went down with a devastating Achilles injury. The team has since turned to Jameis Winston, and the passing game has looked better while the record continues to suffer. With 2 extremely costly years still left on the Deshaun Watson deal and many more expensive contracts throughout the roster, the future is looking just as bleak as the present for the Cleveland Browns. Can we step in and turn the tide for the most hopeless team in the NFL? Let's hop in and find out on EA's Madden NFL 25 franchise mode. So let's get this Madden 25 journey underway here. And as this journey begins, I want to emphasize that this will be a realistic franchise rebuild, as realistic as I think I've done on my channel. I do a lot in the draft only realm of things on this channel, and so switching up a bit to a realism focused series sounds a lot of fun to me, and I hope it does to you as well. But what exactly will that entail? I've come up with 5 house rules that we will be using in this franchise rebuild to keep things as realistic as possible. Let's go through them now. The first rule we will be implementing will be revolving around trading away veteran players. I find this to be probably the least realistic aspects of most YouTube series for Madden, in that you can trade veterans for way more than they get in real life trades. And so I've come up with a rule set that I'll be using on trading away players that are at least 28 years old at the time of the trade. And up on your screen, you should see kind of the scale that I will be using. We're only going to be getting day 3 picks, and I know you can get 3rd and sometimes even 2nd rounders for a lot of these guys that are kind of low to mid 80s players. That's just not going to be the way we're going to do things here. I think it shortcuts the rebuild in a sense. I want this to be a kind of series where we still have needs, you know, in year 4, 5, whatever of this rebuild. And I think the biggest shortcut again on YouTube when playing Madden franchise long term is that players are getting day 2 picks for guys that just simply do not really get there in real life. And there are exceptions to the rule, like say Myles Garrett, who's literally the best edge in the game. If we go to, I went the wrong way here, he's the #1 ranked right end in all of football. Yeah, that guy's gonna fetch more than this scale is. Not saying that I'm planning on trading Myles Garrett anytime soon. I certainly am not. I'd love for him to retire a Cleveland Brown, but that caliber of player, we could make an exception to the rule. But for the most part, and I would say even there's a likelihood that 100% of any vets trades we do will be following that scale. Let's get into the second rule here, and this will revolve around free agency. So free agency, I really want the motivations to matter in free agency here. So that any player signed in the first 2 periods of free agency, of course there's 3 offseason free agency periods, must have at least yellow interest in joining the team. Anybody who just doesn't like the fit with Cleveland, we're not even going to be allowed to attempt to sign. In addition to that, players signed in the first period of free agency must be signed to the player-friendly APY at a minimum. So even if a guy has green interest in joining the Cleveland Browns, we still got to overpay. And that's kind of to simulate the fact that, that initial rush of free agency in real life, people are getting some big time contracts. Just remember how explosive the guard market has been recently for guys that have been signed early in free agency. That's just one example, but guys signed early in free agency typically sign really big contracts, and that's how we're going to simulate it. I will not be held to the amount of years in the player-friendly contract, just the money per year. As for the third and final period, I'm not putting any restrictions in terms of player interest there, just because at that point they're fighting for a job. If somebody has an offer that's above kind of a red interest at that point, then yes, I will still hold myself to the yellow interest or higher. But if somebody has no offers in the final period, it's going to be free reign for us to go in and try and sign them. The same will be for preseason free agency. I'm not going to restrict myself on the interest there, because those guys, again, are just trying to get some sort of job in the NFL at that point. Rule number 3 is revolving around re-signing players. Now, typically, I have not put any restrictions on re-signing in my previous gameplays of Madden here on this series, but I think it'll add an interesting challenge to also require yellow interest to sign players back onto the team. Now, this will apply just to players that are 87 overall or 86 overall or lower. Anybody under an 87 overall. Now, this overall might change throughout the series if we think it's too high or too low, but I do think there's a caliber of player that no matter what their interest is, they're good enough that you're just going to try to make it work no matter what. But for a lot of these, good starters, but maybe not quite star level players that are not interested in coming back, you can just send them to free agency. Now, of course, the incentive to do that in real life is compensatory picks. So that doesn't exist in Madden. So in the case of that, we'll have to be ahead of the curve and probably trade them away to a team that they do have interest in re-signing with, either at the trade deadline or maybe, in the preseason or off-season prior to their final year. A lot of these players, at least the important ones, won't be 28 years old or older yet, so we will not be restricted by our vet scale. I think there's a difference in, let's just say for an example, because I know there is one on this team, Greg Newsome. He has no interest in coming back to the Cleveland Browns. So unless by the time he's ready for a re-sign, he's 87 overall or higher, we're not going to be able to bring him back. So do we get proactive and trade him away? I think Greg Newsome is a good enough player. He will be 25 years old in just a moment here, but that you can get a day 2 pick for him for a team that needs a corner. He's not a first round return by any means, I don't think, but a late round 2 or an early or anywhere in round 3, I think it would be adequate value for a guy like Greg Newsome. moving on to rule number 4, which will be revolving around drafting. Now, this one's a little bit less baked in realism and more a little bit baked in challenge. I do know that teams do more than one trade up or one trade down in the draft in real life. I just think it's too easy to predict where players will go in the game of Madden, and so you can really just maneuver around the draft board and get every single player kind of that you want. And I want the challenge of having to, not get every single player that I want in a draft, where if I want a certain player really badly and it requires a trade up to do that, I can't trade up anywhere in the class, vice versa with trading down as well. Again, a little bit more challenge than realism for this rule, but I also think trading all of your picks in a draft and going up and down everywhere is also a little bit unrealistic. So it does a little bit of both for this series. And then the final rule here, rule number 5, is just going to be gameplay. And this is just where I'm going to talk about how we are going to handle gameplay in this franchise. Number 1, we'll be using 15-minute quarters. We're going to try that. It might end up being too many high-scoring games, too many plays being run in a game. If that's the case, we can tweak it. But I think 15-minute quarters with a 13-second runoff might be pretty adequate if you count the number of plays. All I'm going to do to really judge this is go by plays and compare it to the average amount of plays run in an NFL game. If it's too high, it's too low, we can make adjustments from there. That's how we're going to start it off. And before we get any further here into the video, I want to be utterly transparent with the style of franchise that we will be running here on the channel. I play franchise mode by watching the game's CPU versus CPU style here, and we're doing so, as an example, week 18 against the Baltimore Ravens. We're going to watch the final about 2.5 minutes in a tied ball game to end the season. As you can tell here, we've simmed a little bit here into the season. The Browns are now 3-13. I'll show you kind of the results of the final games at the conclusion of this, but as we head to the 2-minute warning of this game, I think this style of gameplay is just the best way to play if you're looking for kind of the GM simulation mode experience. It puts, in my opinion, all of the emphasis as Njoku, just with a massive fumble after the reception there, puts all the emphasis on the team building aspect. Not anything goes to how good I am at the game. And when I draft a player, I feel like, especially in a game like Madden, if you draft a receiver, you can pretty much guarantee that he won't be a bust when you play the games. You could just force feed him the crap out of the ball, and he's just going to get a ton of targets, and let's get production, etc., get all the XP to improve. Whereas in this style of rebuild, there's a lot bigger risk of drafting busts, and there's just different things that you need to pay attention to. You need to pay attention to a player's traits, especially, at the quarterback position, because you're not controlling the quarterback. Their traits then come into play, which again just makes it more likely that they can bust. And I've played Madden, actually played the game on this channel before, and I feel like it's made the rebuilds a lot shorter just because the competitive spirit in me kind of makes me want to spam the overpowered plays and stuff like that. And as much as I might try to limit myself in that capacity, I often just can't help myself. Again, it's my competitive spirit. If I know a certain play is going to have a better chance of picking up the third down, even though it might be, the 5th time in that game that I've run that play, I'm just going to do it. And I know there are ways like limiting plays and stuff that you can keep that from happening, but just in my mind, watching the game like this is the most fun way to play the game. Ever since I was introduced to it by Mr. Hurricane and his recent Jaguars franchise is kind of what prompted me to start this franchise mode. It's just, I can't really go back to playing the game how I used to. It's just not nearly as satisfying to me as it once was. I like being able to credit the players for doing well and credit the team building rather than my own skill. And that's ultimately why I play the game this way. I also think for the most part, these games play out pretty well, and I think they play out in a wide variety of ways. You get a pretty high scoring game here, but not all the games are going to be pretty high scoring. I think maybe, the time management issues certainly rear their head in ugly ways in this kind of game, but the CPU is going to have terrible time management issues whether you're playing them in CPU versus CPU or you're playing them user versus CPU. So at least in this way, both teams are subjected to it, and so you're going to win some games based off terrible time management, and you're going to lose some as well. Whereas when you're just playing the CPU, you're always going to be at the advantage in that spot. So again, I think it levels the playing field, puts the emphasis on the players, and lets me just kind of play the GM, which is really what I want to do in franchise mode. I don't care as much about how good or bad I am at the game. I care about building a good Super Bowl caliber roster. And I think this is the best way to measure just how good you are at doing that. If you have no influence as to how these guys play, I get you could do certain things like put them in good playbooks, etc. But ultimately it comes down to them whether or not they succeed, and not down to you. We got 20 seconds left here. If we go to overtime, we'll probably just simulate it, but 3rd and 10 here, 16 seconds left. I think it's going to be pretty difficult to do that with no timeouts. So it looks like the Browns will finish at 3-14. We'll see just what pick that puts us here. As I'll go kind of through the rest of the games. As of course, in real life, we are about to play week 15. That was almost caught by Elijah Moore. That would have been an insane play. As I said, it's never boring with Jameis Winston. He's taking some shots here in the final seconds of these games. And I was really hoping to honestly have him as he throws the pick right on cue. I was really hoping to have him for next year as kind of at least an option in case we were unable to draft a quarterback. But this cap situation is a mess in Cleveland, so he's not going to be able to be back, unfortunately for us. That's going to do it for the final game of the season for the Cleveland Browns, falling to the division rival Baltimore Ravens, giving them their 12th win of the season. 2 turnovers in the final 2 minutes of this game ultimately made the difference. The Browns had a chance to snap their losing streak and put another loss on, a playoff caliber team inside your division. It always feels nice to do that, but just couldn't get the job done here. Late in this one, the Ravens were clutch on both sides of the ball, whereas we were the absolute opposite of that. Since, of course, we are in week 15 in real life, I'll show you how the game played out these other matchups. We would lose 25-32 to the Chiefs, yet another one-score victory for Kansas City. Get absolutely blown out by the Bengals, who themselves are struggling this season, but they'll be a formidable foe for us down the line in this franchise. And we got shut out by the Miami Dolphins defense heading into this game. So things were really, really bad heading into this matchup with the Ravens. Ended up playing a pretty good game, but lost it in the end, as we saw. And that's going to give Cleveland the 3rd pick in the draft. We also have Buffalo's 3rd as an extra 3rd-round pick. We don't have any of our own picks in rounds 5 through 7, but we have other teams' picks. So we won't be picking at the top of these rounds like we will be in all the other rounds. But 9 picks in total for Cleveland in our first year. Going to be a lot of pressure to put those picks to good use. So now with the rule set kind of out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the state of this Browns roster as we start this rebuild. I talked about it a little bit in the intro as to kind of how this team has got where it is. But as we start this rebuild with the offseason coming out in the next episode, I think it's important to identify who we view as key players for this rebuild. And for this, we're going to start with the defensive side of the ball because there just strictly are more defensive building blocks on this team. We're much closer to being where we want to be on the defensive side of the ball on the offense. And we got to start with the best player on this team, and that is Myles Garrett here, 28 years old. He will be 29 really for the start of this rebuild. So he's getting up there in age to the point where you know, on a team going into a full rebuild, you're unsure of the timeline. He's still just way too good even consider moving on from, even at this age. He is just an insane athlete. 96 strength is better than most defensive tackles in this game, and his 87 speed and 91 acceleration is faster than most edge players. He's absolutely wild. He has 90 plus in all of power move, finesse move, and block shedding, with a 98 power move being his best. Really good tackler. I mean, he just does not have a weakness. In my opinion, he is the best edge player in football in real life, and I think that is reflected in this game. I know there are arguments for other players, and you know, the best edge in the league is always a fun debate. My money is on Myles Garrett. I just think he's my most the funnest player to watch play from the edge spots in the league, and I'm excited to have him in the rebuilds. Just having a dominant edge player, even if it's for, you know, 3-4 years, and then we got to figure out a way to replace him. I'm keeping him on the team. I would like for Myles Garrett to retire a Brown, if at all possible. The second best player on this defense is Denzel Ward, and he sure is going to be a key piece for this rebuild as well. Another guy who's kind of getting to the point where the timeline might be a little messed up. He's going to be 28 years old for us in the first real year of this rebuild, which is good. Corners do fall off really quickly in real life. I have not yet developed an XP system or anything, so right now we're just using the base XP sliders. That might change as soon as, you know, the next couple of episodes. But Denzel Ward, even again, kind of like Myles Garrett, he's just kind of the caliber of player that even though he might be a vet, things are going to have to be really bad for me to consider moving on from Denzel Ward, and they're probably going to have to be really bad for a couple of years. He's a guy that I would love to have, again, retire a Brown. He's got solid size. You know, the size is certainly not his strength by any means, but his speed is excellent. His athleticism, he has really good catching at the corner spot, which you have to appreciate. He can play both man and zone coverage. He can press despite not being the biggest guy. His only weakness is that 53 tackling really sucks. And that's just kind of a theme of this Cleveland cornerback room. They do not value corners that can tackle. That's probably the least important thing you need from a corner anyway. So if you can do everything else other than tackle, you're a dang good corner here. He's got acrobat and deep route KO here, which you'll love to see. Gonna limit those explosive plays. And I'm excited to have Denzel Ward as part of this defense. He's currently injured, but the next key player for us to build around in this franchise rebuild is Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah here. And at just 24 years old, he is such a good zone cover player. And I've realized that people who have really long names, their secondary attributes for some reason go to the left side rather than the right where they usually are. I don't know why that is, but excellent athletes. That's really going to help him in coverage. 93 pursuit is really good play rec. Needs to be a little bit better against the run with, you know, only the 69 block shedding, which is of course nice, and the 83 tackle, but he can catch pretty well. He's even got solid man coverage at 70 is not bad at all. 87 jumping is really good. I expect him to be a linebacker for the long haul for the Cleveland Browns in this rebuild, and he should be good to go for next season. 221 is pretty light, but you know, it doesn't hurt him too much on the football field. He's an excellent player. I think that concludes the key players for our defense. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who I have not named is a bum and that we're going to move on from them. There are some players that are really good that I want to keep around. I just don't think they're necessarily kind of that building block caliber player. Let's start here with Greg Newsome, who I would consider a key player, but based on the rules, we might not be able to keep this guy. He does not want to be here. He's coming up on a contract year. I really like Greg Newsome, so I would love to figure out a way to get him to 87 overall for us to be able to re-sign him based on our rules, because I'd love to just have him be a long-term corner on this team. But ultimately, it's kind of the own rule set that's screwing me over and forcing him not to be considered a key piece for this rebuild. Still really want to re-sign him though. He's going to be he's 6 foot 192, really good size, really good athleticism. Again, can't tackle at all, but he can do kind of everything else. He's kind of a Denzel Ward light. I really like this player. and I'm going to do what I can to try to get him to that 87 overall mark so we can keep him on the team. And then at that point, he would be a key player for me. Next up is Grant Delpit, who is just another really solid starter. I think the Browns secondary is certainly the strength of their team, and it's going to be a position group that I probably don't target at all here in our first offseason because of how solid it is. He's going to be 26 years old and an 81 overall though for next year, unless he gets, of course, an upgrade at some point in the offseason cycle. So that's why he's just in that good starter caliber player where not looking to replace him by any means, but I wouldn't necessarily call him a core piece. His man coverage isn't not great, but he's good in zone. Unfortunately, the way kind of Madden works, you kind of need to be good at both as a safety because they don't work in a way where, you know, the free safety is always the deep zone guy and the strong safety is always in the slot. It's kind of just whichever way the offense has their slot player, that safety kind of goes down and plays a role. So kind of the zone specialist kind of player, which definitely works in real life, doesn't quite work in Madden. I don't really think there's a way to make it work. And so a guy who I think works really well in real life, but again, just kind of that weaker man coverage makes him not maybe quite as good. He's under contract though, and I think he'll be a starter definitely for the next 2 seasons. So wouldn't worry about replacing him by any means. The next guy I kind of want to talk about is Martin Emerson Jr. If we end up having to move on from Greg Newsome, I think we have a really solid corner in the wings now. I think he starts at a 75 overall. He's already had a couple of upgrades here as we have simulated to week 18 at this point, and he had like 3 upgrades for some reason. I'm not going to complain. Not nearly the athlete that we see from Denzel Ward and from Greg Newsome, just an 89 speed, 91 acceleration, and 84 jumping, all remarkably, worse than the other players. A good press corner, really good size, at 6'2", 200 pounds. You're not going to be as fast when you're that big most of the time. There are some rare cases, of course. A little bit more zone focused, even though he has the man-to-man archetype, which is kind of funny to me. But catching is okay. The other 2 players, in the 70s is kind of where you want to be as a corner. And then again, just can't tackle. You wish for maybe a bigger corner that he'd be a little bit better tackling. Maybe he could be a slot corner. And he's just kind of not that player. And that's kind of the thing with the Browns is you have 3 good corners. I don't think any of them are, the ideal slot. I think all of them you want on the outside. And so what will we do with that? I think we'll figure that out soon. I'll have to see kind of who plays in the slot for the Browns in real life. I got to be honest, other than when the Browns played the Eagles, my favorite team, haven't watched a ton of Browns this year. So I'll figure that out and we'll probably rock with that to start. And then one more player to talk about on the defense, and that will be rookie Mike Hall Jr. here at the defensive tackle spot. Is currently injured right now, but it's just a 1-week injury, so he'll be back really soon. Not very strong, but has really good athleticism speed-wise. Pretty well rounded with his power, block shed, and finesse all within 2 of each other. But that 82 strength, I think, really is going to limit him a bit in the run game to the point where he might just always be a kind of a rush DT, maybe a dime package player. And so certainly going to factor into this rebuild in a pretty major way, just because I think that the defensive tackle spot is one of the weakest on the teams. And so he's going to be playing. But I just don't think he's ever going to be a full-time player because of that low strength in Madden. That matters so much in the run game to have that high strength. And he just has, really low strength for a defensive tackle. He might even be a guy that if we want to play him in base, might be a base defensive end that goes inside for the dime packages and some nickel packages. That might be his best role for us in the near future. So where does that leave the defense as a whole? I think they have a really big strength in the secondary. Didn't talk about Juan Thornhill, but he's a guy that is going to play for us next year. Is kind of just a replacement level safety. But, for year 1 of a rebuild, you're going to take replacement level, I think, at this point. You have some really good players. Denzel Ward, Myles Garrett, and Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, who is not listed here, again, because of his injury. Really solid pieces at all 3 levels. You have a good linebacker, you have a good DL, you have a stud D-back, but in a lot of the cases, you need help around the studs. I think, once again, I kind of mentioned it earlier, the secondary is going to be pretty good. I do not imagine myself really adding to this secondary in our first offseason. I think we're going to go with these kind of 5 core players, all star dev plus, all at least in the mid 70s, which is good enough for a year 1 of a rebuild at the very least. And so I like that. Other than that, I think the linebacker spot, we could really use somebody to go alongside Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. Hicks, good vet. He's been in the league for quite some time, started with the Eagles and has had some really good years, but he's going to be regressing, and Devin Bush just has not worked out as a former first-round pick. And then Myles Garrett is dominant, but he needs some help here on the defensive line. Hall Jr., of course, is not pictured here again because of injury, but that's not the guy that you want kind of looking long-term to be your second best defensive lineman at all. So D-line is going to be a very high priority. Maybe a linebacker to go alongside Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. That will probably be a little bit lower tier of a priority for me, whereas the defensive line is definitely going to be at the top of my needs list. So let's switch things over to the offensive side of the football now and talk about the state of this roster. Not going to be nearly as many key players to talk about for this offensive side of the football. Let's start with the best player on the offensive side, and that's David Njoku, who is going to be 29 years old, kind of in that Myles Garrett category, Denzel Ward, where these guys are in their late 20s. How do they match up with how good this team is going to be? I think it puts some level of pressure on me to be good pretty quickly to see if we can't, make a run with these players before they kind of regress and move out of the team, and we have to start kind of a phase 2 of this franchise rebuild. That's certainly going to be on the mind here, but David Njoku is just an absolutely awesome athlete at the tight end position who has really good catching ratings. He does have the drops passes trait though that hurts that a little bit here. As a run blocker, he's okay. He's not atrocious, but he's not somebody that's going to, I think, make a big impact in the run game. And so, he's the best receiving talent there is on this Browns team, and somebody that whatever we do at the quarterback position is going to love having a guy like David Njoku at the tight end spot. In terms of his contract, we've got him around for just next season, which we're going to have to think about, of course, that re-sign. And you look at his abilities, we might have to sign him early on in the season, because if we keep losing, that impact there is going to turn red, and he's going to have no interest in signing, which is going to make it tough. Of course, he will be above 87 overall, so we'll be able to sign him either way, but you want it to be a little bit easier on the re-sign. And honestly, I think that's the only player that you can truly consider a key piece to the rebuilds. There are some players that are solid starters that we're going to be keeping. I think the elephant in the room, of course, with this team is Nick Chubb. He's going to be 29 years old next year. And injuries have really held him back for, 2023 and 2024. Has not been able to be fully involved in either of these seasons, unfortunately, with that, really just unfortunate injury that he suffered. He is on an expiring deal. He has some interest in re-signing, but a 29-year-old running back with the state of this offense, also the fact that we have literally $5 million in re-sign room, I think makes it so that we cannot retain Nick Chubb. I'll show you right here. When I go to negotiate players, we have $5 million in 2025 cap room. That's not enough to re-sign Nick Chubb. He's gonna have to go. Otherwise, he of course would be a key piece. He's an excellent running back for us. I think the age, the salary cap is gonna just make it not work. And I think that might be the case in real life, which is kind of why I'm, okay with letting him go in this franchise series. You don't love to lose a player of the caliber of Nick Chubb, but it's probably just gonna happen. Other than that, we have some solid starters here. Let's go along the offensive line. Starting with Wyatt Teller, who still has that superstar development, which you always love to see. Nasty streak and post up. He's going to be really good, blocking downfield and going with the double teams. Good player for sure. I don't know if he'll keep that superstar dev for long. I think he's going to be maybe next year a star dev player, 30 years old, low 80s. Yeah, that's a good player. You're not going to replace him by any means, but I wouldn't call that a key piece to the offensive line. Batonio here, he's probably going to be somebody that we have to trade in the offseason just for some cap space, honestly. He's going to be 33 years old, probably going to regress into the low 80s, and he's going to be on a pretty decent contract that, you know, we need some sort of cap space just to be able to do anything. So 15.7, probably for a low 80s overall player. Probably going to be a cap casualty for us, unfortunately. Get a day 3 pick to somebody who really needs a guard. And then Jerry Jeudy is a pretty solid wide receiver option for us. He is signed for a decent bit. Gonna start for us for sure. I just wouldn't call him a key piece. I think, you know, he's about to be 26 years old, and that's kind of where the development starts to slow down a lot, is once you get past that age 24, 25 mark. And he just doesn't have a skill set that you look at and say, yes, he's very good there. The speed, good. The catching, good. The route running, good. But he's kind of just a jack of all trades kind of player. I don't think he's a wide receiver 1. I think he's more of a complementary receiver, maybe even best suited for a slot role, although that's not necessary because he does have a release. Other than that, I think everybody's kind of replacement level or lower. Not pictured here is Jedrick Wills, but he's also in the same situation where, you know, he's mid-70s guy in a contract year and we don't have any money. Conklin here, the other guy to talk about, 30 years old, now into the 70s. This offensive line just is not what it used to be. I remember when Cleveland was considered one of the best O-lines in the league, and it's just been a tough going recently for this Cleveland offensive line. And then, of course, we've saved this situation for the very last because it's a very tough situation to talk about in Cleveland. But let's get into the quarterback situation right now, starting with the man who is playing for this team, Jameis Winston. I gotta be honest, I think my plan A heading into this series was to have Jameis play quarterback for us next year. That's not gonna be an option. He will play for us, you know, in this final game, which I will have already showcased at this point in the recording. But Jameis, you know, good bridge quarterback in case there's no quarterback that we want to take in this upcoming draft. But yeah, it's never going to be boring with Jameis Winston. He's going to make some big plays. He's also going to make some big mistakes. I don't think that's totally reflected here in this game quite as accurately. You know, aggressive decision maker does put that into account, but Jameis would have loved to have him at least as an option for next year, but he's on an expiring. He's just not going to be here for the squad. You just can't go through a Cleveland Browns franchise rebuild without talking about Deshaun Watson. Talked about it in the intro as one of the reasons that the Browns are in the situation that they are, in such a tough spot. You know, maybe if not one of the most, you know, if not the most hopeless franchise, I think right now in the league, certainly kind of in that top tier, all because of Deshaun Watson. And for this franchise rebuild, I'm going to keep it strictly to what this guy is doing on the field. You know, we're playing a video game, we're trying to have fun, and what Deshaun Watson's deals have been off the field are very well documented at this point. I don't think talking about it on this channel is really worth anything. But even if you just consider the on-field product, Deshaun Watson, and it's evidenced here by his rating, it just is not a starting caliber prospect anymore. You mortgaged so many draft picks to acquire him. And while that part of, you know, the horror story of this signing might be over, the part that's not over is you still owe him $73 million that are 100% guaranteed for each of the next 2 seasons. If he were to start for us next year, and we'll talk about that in just a minute or two, he would be both probably the worst starting quarterback in the league and the most expensive starting quarterback in the league. That's just a combo that you cannot have. Simply cannot have. He's the reason we only have $5 million to spend on free agents. You know, there are a couple of really big contracts elsewhere around the squad that are contributing to that as well, but they're for really good players. Like, I think Denzel Ford is costing us 30 million or something close to that, but you'll pay that for, I think, one of the top 10 corners at least in the NFL. But you're paying the most money at the quarterback spot for the worst starter in the league. And something I want to just bring up, I think one of the things I want to do is keep the comment section involved in this series as much as possible. Have you guys have, a say in kind of what goes on. And so for this episode, I want you all to vote if we should even leave the door open for Deshaun Watson to start for us next year. Free agency is pretty much out of the question for the quarterback spot. We can make a couple of moves, release a couple of players, make some money, but I don't think it'll be enough to really sign even a stopgap starter quarterback. That might be the case. Maybe I think like Justin Fields will be available. I don't know how much he's going to ask. Jameis is asking for more money than we'll be able to pay him to bring him back. But should we even open the door, or is it going to be rookie or bust? I think no matter what the vote is, if there's a good enough rookie, we'll probably just take them and start them. But I want to know if starting Deshaun Watson next year should even be viewed as an option. Let me know in the comment section below your thoughts on the matter. It's hard to ask what your opinion of Deshaun Watson is, though, before we actually give you a preview of this quarterback class. So that's exactly what we're going to do here at the very end of this episode. I'll only preview kind of what my thoughts are for the very first pick in the class and kind of the quarterback options available. I'm not going to give my full draft thoughts. That will be in the next episode. I think there are two quarterbacks worth considering in this class. Stark was viewed as QB2, but he has recently popped up to the top quarterback just ahead of Glenn Davis, although I would have him as QB3, and that's why he's the only one not on my favorites board out of the round one quarterback prospects in this class. Let's go through them right now. Glenn Davis, 21 years old, 6'4", 231 pounds. If you look at his physicals, he's going to be above average in his athleticism speed-wise, and he's going to have a pretty good arm. Not the elite arm, but certainly good enough. He's going to have really good throw under pressure and throw on the run ratings, which you really like. Those are a little bit harder to develop than maybe the accuracy, which I feel like is pretty straightforward in terms of developing. I think out of these three quarterbacks, he's actually maybe the worst in accuracy, with an A and a B and no shot at short accuracy being an A. I think the other two guys have 2 A's and a B, if I'm not mistaken. He does have good play action as well, which is another one that's really hard to develop in the game. Good break sack, B awareness. But what I think makes him my QB1 right now is his traits. With the way that we're doing this franchise series, you need to have quarterbacks that have good traits, and he is the only one that has the stands tall in the pocket and always aware of pressure. That is the ideal sense of pressure rating for the quarterback, which is going to really help him simulate well. Does well to avoid sacks by throwing the ball away. That can be conservative or ideal. The fact that those two are kind of like the same in the game drives me nuts, because you don't know. Of course, you'd rather have ideal than conservative, but he's not aggressive. None of these quarterbacks are. The other quarterback we'll talk about here is Paul Kirkland, another 21-year-old, 6'2", 230 pounds. A little bit worse with the speed, but the acceleration's there and the arms kind of in that same spot. 2 A's and a B in terms of his accuracy. His throw under the pressure is good. His throw on the run is good. His break sack is good. His awareness is good. Like the other guy, he does have bad injury though. His play action could be a B or a C. The one thing that puts him slightly below and as quarterback 2 is pressure does not face him because he does not know it's there. That is the oblivious sense of pressure traits, which isn't great. It means he's probably going to get sacked a lot, which is going to lead to fumbles because quarterbacks cannot hold on to the ball in this game. And then I'll just talk about the guy who's become quarterback 1, another 21-year-old. All of them are 21. He's got pressure does not phase him because he doesn't know it's there. Again, the oblivious, which you don't like. He does have the strongest arm of the bunch here. Speed and acceleration, all these guys are pretty similar. I just don't like that his throw on the run, throw under pressure, and break sack and all that is worse. And his injury is also an F. None of these guys have good injury at the quarterback spots. None of them have great awareness either, which makes me think that none of these guys are going to be, a generational type quarterback. Nothing in their player card says so, but he has 2 A's for short and medium accuracy and a B to C for his deep. Certainly not a bad quarterback by any means, but I would put him as QB3, and since he's the top ranked, that just keeps him just off my favorite board. But the Glenn Davis, again, the separator here is you have 2 oblivious senses of pressure and an ideal sense of pressure. That's going to put Glenn Davis over the top with 3 quarterbacks that are honestly really similar. I do think Glenn Davis is a first-round caliber quarterback, but I don't think he's going to be the best player in the class. So it's, do you take quarterback or do you maybe take BPA? I do think there are 2 edge players, which will be a need for this team, that could potentially be better. We need to know James Miner's finesse moves. If it's A, I think he could be on the board for us just because he is an elite athlete with A awareness and A tackle. We don't know a lot about these players because I could not do anything with the scouting starting in week 15, but he's got to have A finesse moves for it to be worth it. But if he does, the combination of, awareness, finesse moves, tackle, athleticism will put James Miner on the board. And then the other player that I think is really good is also an edge player, Daniel Gibson. He's got A power moves and B finesse moves, so he's going to be a really good pass rusher. We don't know what his block shedding is yet. He's not quite the athlete in terms of his top speed, but his acceleration is great. His strength is great. I think if I could have anybody with my pick, Daniel Gibson is the best player in the class if we're strictly going BPA. But if we're saying that we need to have a rookie quarterback, that we can't see Deshaun Watson play another down of football for the Cleveland Browns, that obviously puts Glenn Davis as the number 1 prospect on the board. But my top 4 right now, I think these tackles are good. To be fair, I just don't think they're going to be good enough. We're not talking about later rounds in the class, but just as a spoiler alert, I do think kind of the mid rounds will be pretty good for the offensive line in this class. And so that puts edge rusher and quarterback, 2 very big needs on this team, on the mind for our first pick in the class. But again, let me know what you think of the quarterback situation in the comment section below, and any other thoughts you have, maybe on the rules, something we could tweak, add, remove, etc. I'm open for everything. This is just kind of what we're starting the franchise with rules-wise, and I'm excited to get this franchise rebuild underway. I hope you are too. We'll be coming up quickly with the off season. As you can see, I kind of recorded this in a weird way where I've showed you the results of the Ravens and Browns game already, although I haven't actually played it at this point in the recording. Just a little bit odd order here for the recording. But like I said, we'll be getting into the off season in the next episode, and I want to hear your thoughts. Any thoughts you have on the franchise rebuild heading up to it. We'll be back soon with more Cleveland Browns Madden 25 franchise rebuild, and I'll see you then.